The Montana sky stretched wide and endless, a painted ceiling of blue that seemed to swallow everything beneath it, and beneath that sky Samuel Rourke carried out another day of work, just as he had for the last 15 years. The rhythm of the ranch was steady, predictable, unchanging, fences mended, cattle driven, water hauled, barns checked. It was the sameness that Samuel clung to because sameness left no room for remembering. When the mind wandered, when it strayed into memory, the pain came back sharp and merciless, the memory of his wife's smile, the sound of her voice carried by the wind, and the way her hand had felt in his before it slipped away forever. 15 years had gone since she and their unborn child had been laid into the earth, and in all those years Samuel had hardened himself into a man who worked from dawn until night with no thought of what was missing. The people in town called him a ghost, though never to his face. They said he didn't laugh, didn't linger for conversation, didn't notice women who sometimes cast hopeful glances his way. A man of 45, with broad shoulders and hands roughened by endless labor, Samuel had buried not only his wife but also his desire for company. The land was enough, the cattle were enough, silence was enough, at least, that's what he told himself each time he sat alone at his wooden table and ate beans in the dim light of a lantern, or when the nights stretched long and cold, and only the coyotes broke the stillness with their cries. It was on such a day, when the sun had begun its slow descent and the wagon rattled beneath him on the way home from town, that Samuel's life shifted in a way he couldn't have imagined. The horses were restless, eager for the barn, and the supplies in the wagon bed clinked together as the wheels bumped over ruts in the dirt road. Samuel wasn't thinking of much beyond supper and the work waiting for him tomorrow, but as his ranch came into view, he noticed something unusual. At first he thought his eyes played tricks on him, some figure on the porch, sitting where no one ever sat. He slowed the horses, his jaw tightening. As he drew nearer, the figure became clear, a woman, dressed in a travel-worn gown of muted gray, a bonnet tilted back on her head. She rose quickly at his approach, clutching a small carpetbag to her chest like a lifeline. Her face was smudged from dust, her shoes scuffed from miles of travel, but her eyes, large, searching, bright even in weariness, fixed on him with a kind of desperate hope. "Mr. Rourke," she called, her voice tremulous but carrying across the space between them. Samuel's boots hit the ground as he stepped down from the wagon, every sense alert, suspicion knotting his stomach. He hadn't had visitors in years, and certainly not uninvited strangers, let alone women waiting on his porch. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady and rough. She swallowed, gathering courage before answering. "My name is Eliza Hartwell. I was sent here, as your bride." The words stopped him cold, as if someone had driven a spike straight through the center of his chest. His brows furrowed, and he stared at her, unable to process what she'd just said. "My what? Your mail-order bride," she explained quickly, the words tumbling out as though she feared he might cut her off. "The agency in Denver arranged everything. I answered an ad. A widower rancher in need of companionship and help with his homestead. They said this was your ranch. They sent me to you." For a long moment, only the sound of wind stirred in the tall grass around them. Samuel's face hardened, his jaw set, and his eyes darkened beneath the brim of his hat. "I never placed an ad," he said finally, his voice a low growl. "Someone's made a mistake." Her lips parted, her eyes widening with a mix of shock and dread. The carpetbag slipped slightly in her grasp as though her arms had suddenly weakened. "A mistake," she whispered, the color draining from her cheeks. "That can't be." She looked down, pressing trembling fingers against the worn fabric of the bag. "I sold everything to come here. Everything. I thought I was beginning a new life." Samuel felt something stir inside him, something he didn't want to acknowledge. He had spent years mastering the art of silence, of pushing feelings so deep they couldn't claw their way out, but the sight of this young woman trembling on his porch with nowhere to go pierced through that silence like a crack in old timber. He wanted to turn away, to tell her to head back to Denver, to insist she'd been misled and had no place here. Yet he couldn't ignore the vulnerability in her voice, the way she looked at him not just with confusion but with a silent plea. "You can stay the night," he said at last, his voice clipped, almost reluctant. "But come morning, we'll see about finding you another place. This ranch it isn't for you." Eliza nodded quickly, but the way her shoulders sank betrayed her disappointment. She stepped aside as he led the horses into the barn, her figure small against the fading light. By the time they entered the house, night had begun to press against the windows. Samuel lit a lamp, its glow spreading weakly across the worn wooden floor and the plain furniture that filled the room. He gestured toward the spare room at the end of the hall, a place rarely used, its bed covered in an old quilt his wife had once stitched. Eliza carried her bag inside, her steps careful, and Samuel stood for a moment watching her disappear into the room before turning away. He ate his supper in silence, the scrape of his fork against the plate louder than it should have been, each sound reminding him of the stranger now under his roof. When he finally lay down in his bed, sleep refused to come. Through the thin wall, he heard the faintest sound, a muffled sob, quickly stifled. He stared at the ceiling, his chest tight, his throat dry. He had no words for comfort, no room left in his heart for someone else's pain. Or so he told himself. But something about her voice, the way it broke, the way it carried loneliness that matched his own, dug deep into him. He closed his eyes, but the image returned, Eliza Hartwell standing on his porch with dust in her hair and hope in her eyes, a hope that had nowhere to rest. And though Samuel didn't yet know it, though he resisted even the thought, that moment marked the first crack in the walls he had spent 15 years building. Fate had set something in motion on that July evening, something he could not stop, and in the quiet of his darkened room, with the sound of her sorrow drifting faintly through the boards, Samuel Rourke began to realize that life, despite his best efforts, wasn't finished with him yet. The morning sun rose steady over the plains, casting a gold haze across the fields, and Samuel Rourke felt the familiar pull of the day's work waiting for him. But as he pushed open the kitchen door, he stopped short, the scene before him breaking the sameness he had lived with for so long. Eliza Hartwell was already there, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair pinned back in a loose bun that had strands falling around her face, a small cloud of flour clinging to her dress. She moved with quiet determination, pulling biscuits from the oven, a pot of coffee steaming on the stove. The scent filled the room, warmth and comfort, things Samuel had not woken to in 15 years. For a moment he stood in the doorway, watching her, a strange heaviness pressing into his chest. He hadn't invited her presence, yet there she was, moving as though she belonged. "You didn't have to do that," he muttered finally, his voice rough from sleep. She turned, startled, then offered him a faint smile. "I couldn't just sit idle. I was raised to be useful. I know I don't belong here, but while I am, I thought I should do something to earn the roof over my head." Samuel shifted uneasily, lowering himself into the chair at the table. The clatter of plates filled the silence as she set food before him, simple but made with care. He ate with slow, deliberate movements, his eyes straying toward her as she poured him coffee. There was no denying her hands were skilled, practiced in the way of tending to others, but what unsettled him most was the gentleness in her manner. It had been years since anyone had served him a meal, years since a woman's presence had filled the empty spaces of his home. Over the next days, what should have been temporary stretched into something more. Each morning Samuel woke intending to tell her she needed to leave, and each evening another reason surfaced for her to stay just a little longer. Eliza never complained, never pressed him with questions, never demanded anything beyond a corner of space in his house. She worked without being asked, feeding the chickens, scrubbing the floors that had long collected dust, mending the shirts Samuel had worn until they were nearly threadbare. She carried herself with quiet strength, and in her presence, Samuel felt the strange pull of memory, of what his life had once been, of what it might have been if loss hadn't gutted him. Still, he kept his distance. When she spoke to him, he answered curtly, his words clipped and practical. When she smiled, he looked away, unwilling to let himself feel the tug that stirred in him. His grief was a constant companion, a shadow he refused to shake, and he told himself that letting Eliza slip into his life was dangerous. She was not his, not meant for him. She had come here by mistake. Yet Eliza, too, carried shadows. At night, when Samuel lay in bed and the ranch house settled into its quiet creaks, he sometimes heard her in the next room, soft sobs muffled against a pillow, the sound of someone breaking in silence. He never asked why, he didn't know how, but the sound lingered with him, filling the empty hours with questions he didn't want to voice. The ranch itself pressed demands that did not pause for the turmoil inside its owner. One afternoon a storm threatened to scatter the cattle, the wind howling across the plains, dark clouds rolling in with a violence that made the air heavy. Samuel saddled his horse, preparing to drive the herd to safer ground, when Eliza appeared at his side, her skirt tucked up, determination flashing in her eyes. "You shouldn't be out in this," he told her sharply. "Stay inside. I won't sit by while you face it alone," she answered, her voice firm. I may not know cattle, but I can ride, and I won't let you fight the storm single-handed. Samuel opened his mouth to argue, but something in her gaze silenced him. Together they rode into the fields, the storm tearing at them with sheets of rain, lightning splitting the horizon. He watched her struggle yet hold firm, her small frame steady on the horse as she drove the cattle with a fierce will he had not expected. By the time they returned, soaked and exhausted, Samuel saw her differently, not as a lost girl left on his porch, but as a woman with fire in her spirit, a woman who would not break easily. It was not long after that a neighbor arrived with urgent news. A fire had torn through a homestead 5 miles east, leaving families displaced, children without shelter. Samuel's instinct was immediate, he would ride out and help, no matter the cost. But as he prepared, Eliza stood before him, her hands clenched, her voice trembling but unyielding. You've been living half a life for 15 years, she told him, her eyes locking with his. You bury yourself in this land, thinking it's enough, but those children need more than cattle driven and fences fixed. They need men who can show up, who can care. And she faltered, then steadied herself, tears glinting in her eyes. I need a place where I can be more than a mistake. Let me stand beside you. Not as a burden, not as someone who landed here by accident, but as a woman who chooses to be here. Her words struck him deeper than he expected, shaking loose something he had hidden away for years. For the first time, Samuel allowed himself to see her, not the dust on her hem or the misfortune of how she'd arrived, but the strength and the longing in her, the courage it took to claim a place in a world that had rejected her. He realized then that fate had not sent her to him by accident. Perhaps it was providence, or perhaps simply chance, but either way, she was no mistake. In the weeks that followed, the lines between them softened. Together they joined neighbors in rebuilding what the fire had destroyed, their days filled with the labor of raising beams and laying boards, their nights with quiet conversations by lamplight. Samuel found himself listening to her laughter, startled each time it bubbled up and broke through the silence he had carried for so long. He reached for her hand one evening beneath the stars, hesitant, reverent, as though touching something sacred, and when her fingers curled around his, a weight lifted from his chest. Eliza had arrived by mistake, yet somehow she fit into the empty places of his life with a rightness he could no longer deny. Samuel Rourke, the rancher who had lived like a ghost, touched her hand and felt the stir of something he thought buried forever. And in that moment, though neither spoke it aloud, both knew that what had begun as an accident was slowly becoming the truth of their lives.